Good afternoon, Frank.
Hi, Professor. How are you?
Okay, since there was nothing very much new that happened this week, I thought we'd talk about our book, Globalization, the Crucial Phase, this week.
I think that's good. I happen to just have the book right here, actually. I was just
Ah,
leafing
well,
through it earlier today. It's
ah,
a wonderful read.
the I think the important thing about it is that to start with, it doesn't look at globalization from a purely Western point of view, as nearly every book on globalization does. But also, it goes to some trouble to work out why we're talking about globalization today rather than some other time. And of course, one of the big arguments about globalization has been, when did it start?
Hmm.
But I think it's much more important to try to work out why we started talking about it when we did. And it's that investigation that led us to work out that we're currently in the crucial phase.
Which is in fact the name of the book. And
Yeah, well, the
yeah,
subtitle is, in, if anything, the globalization, the title is to draw people's attention to what we're talking about, but the crucial phase is what it's really all about.
right.
Uh,
I mean, the crucial phase from my take on it is the uneven rate of globalization worldwide, and even within the United States itself, as we've seen with the incident in Baltimore earlier in the week.
it's the problem that while it's in process faster now than at any other time, the rate of the speed of the process is different in every other part of the world, and that leads to increasing opportunities but increasing problems.
Hmm.
And so many of the problems that we're trying to deal with in the world today, we have no idea why we're trying to deal with all these problems today. We blame it on modernization and globalization instead of understanding that it's part of it's due to the unevenness and the rate of globalization in different parts of the world. And if we understood the whole process, we'd be able to deal better with the problems.
Yes.
I don't know whether you noticed my opening quotation, which from William Gibson, a science fiction writer, the future's already here. It's
Hmm.
just unevenly distributed.
I
And
did see that. Yes.
that's really the text for the whole book. So we start off by explaining the situation, and then the individual chapters each gives a different disciplinary point of view, showing how the current situation is different in different parts of the world, and giving us an idea of what, based on the ideas in the introduction, might need to be done in order to solve these problems.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because I have a little interesting anecdote today. I flew up from Tampa, Florida on Southwest Airlines early this morning. And Southwest Airlines is a low-cost carrier, and one of the reasons they're able to remain low cost is because they rely on technology wherever they can. So a typical traveler, myself included, receives his or her boarding pass via a text message and walks up, slides the iPhone or your portable phone underneath a card reader, and you're allowed to pass through then to go to security. If you don't have an iPhone and you have a paper printed out boarding pass, what then you are required to do is arrive at the electronic kiosk where you deposit your luggage, and then you have to begin to put in your confirmation number, and then you have to put in the credit card number that you used. Now, I was in line behind several groups of people. Some of them were young hipsters who travel all the time, who had the routine down like, like clockwork. And other people, you could tell, had very, very little familiarity with technology, with flying, with finding the right credit card. It was quite infuriating after a while to be in the line behind them. But it began to strike me what an incredible disadvantage these people have uh, in this world. I mean, this was not a rocket science kind of thing. It's how to get a boarding pass to get on an airplane to fly from point A to point B. Yet they couldn't do it without the assistance of a ticket agent who, in a harried manner, had to come and help them and explain to them by coming around and pressing their name in. And it was a very small microcosmic example of what a lot of people are facing now.
And that was in one queue, one line at an airport, and there's similar things going on between different parts of the country, between the Appalachians and the East Coast, and between different countries and different parts of the world.
Correct.
And another thing that people don't really understand is why these differences began in the first place. And it all had to do with the way we spread through the world, and in the last 50,000 years mainly. It's really quite recent. And the fact that we're very adaptable, human beings, our species is much more adaptable than any other species so far, adapts to all new climates and ecologies. And but each new ecological area we got to supported a different rate of population growth because it had a different carrying capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And then as population grew, it supported the growth of civilizations in some parts of the world, but not in other parts of the world. And then, of course, when we finally got to the colonial period, just a couple of hundred years ago, that imposed a sort of straitjacket on the unevenness that had grown up over the last 50,000 years. And now we're dealing with the problems of that unevenness. But the unevenness really is now evening out, so that 50 years ago, China was very uneven between the cities that had been very important centers of innovation since the medieval period and the vast majority of the area of China, which was very backward rural settlements. And now it's an integrated national economy of 1.4 billion people. Mm-hmm. India similarly is catching up to that now, but not as far ahead on it as China is. And Africa has started to catch up, but is taking much longer because it doesn't have the urban past at all that to the extent that China and India had. But this unevenness really is now beginning to even out. The problem is, how are we going to manage the difficulties as it evens out?
Well, one of the things that struck me in the book, simply because of the breadth of the topics that were selected, ranging from dental hygiene to jurisprudence to infrastructure, etc., was that just about every so-called hotspot type of problem on the globe today can be directly attributed to this uneven rate of progress, this uneven rate of globalization. And when you look at it that way, it's like looking at it through a particular prism that all of a sudden allows you to begin to make sense of it. And in a very, dare I say, negative way, because it's then becomes, oh my goodness, this is a huge problem. It's not just a problem you can throw money at. It's a much bigger problem than that. It becomes a cultural / societal kind of problem. And in one respect, the book was very revealing and optimistic, but in another respect, short of just sitting and waiting for the calendar to change, I'm not exactly sure what the solution is.
Well, I think that the big problem that it draws attention to is that the most important things happening in the world now and earlier have to do with change, which we've never studied directly, and more and more minds working together in any species. Mm-hmm. And the reason we've got away with our studies of everything up until the present by studying change only in the past, as in the study of evolution, for example, rather than change as it's happening in the present, which is that it's only now that the rate of change in the present has got to the point where we can't ignore it. But we still have no methodologies for studying it directly as it's in process. We still study situations. Mm-hmm. And then all our biology, all our medicine, all our psychology, everything we do that is the study of some aspect of human life, is directed towards the individual. But in fact, individuals are very different according to the number of people they interact with. And if you look at human history, the number of people living together, the number of minds working together has continuously but very gradually increased from the very beginning up until the present. And it's only in the last 20 years that many more people are working together, that is, they're interacting together, they're in contact with each other, they're aware of what other people are doing, far more than ever before. And the rate of innovation has been much greater in the last 20 years than in any other period of world history. And we don't have any way of explaining that sort of thing because we don't study anything social and we don't study change as it's happening.
So for example, from a historical perspective, if one was, and I'm taking a liberty here, if one was to look back at the cause of Nazi expansionism in the 40s, all right, one would look at the chaos surrounding the Weimar Republic, which was in turn set up to be intentionally chaotic by the French, who were dead set upon a resurrection of any strong Germany as a result of what happened in World War I and the threat, which in turn was a result of the 1870 Franco-German War, which in turn was a result of a previous battle, previous war. That kind of historical study where the changes are noted and they're able to be identified and studied and become the subject of PhD theses. What you're talking about now is present day change that has to be examined because it's affecting everybody right now and it's happening so quickly on such a broad scale. We can't necessarily wait for the dust to settle and read about it in the history books a generation from now.
We need a way to be able to be sensitive to the way things are actually changing under our noses, around us at the moment, and make sense of it so that we understand ourselves to be on a trajectory and can see where the trajectory is heading. It doesn't mean to say we're going to predict the future, but in order to be prepared for the future, we have to understand how we got to where we are today.
At its most optimistic, where would a best case study of globalization, where could that lead us insofar as understanding the future?
It needs to be comparative. We need much more global approaches to the study of the human condition. Everything that's been done so far, even the study of globalization, is based on individual studies in different parts of the world. I mean, the whole idea of world history didn't begin until the 1950s and was very slow to grow in history departments. And the idea of global history is something that didn't begin until the 1980s and has been even slower to grow. It's just we're not yet used to the idea that we have to study process instead of situations. But I think it's coming simply because we're gradually becoming more and more sensitive to the fact that we're living in everything is change all around us, and we've got to understand change.
Now we're two elderly people having a conversation on a technological medium right now, which in turn will be posted on the internet. I mean, from the man in the street perspective, what can be best hoped for their understanding of this globalization and the rate of change?
Well, people are adapting to the way things are changing all the time, but they don't. Again, what happens is social. So the way people change is by finding themselves in situations where they have to interact differently. So all of our forms of interaction now in the Western world are different from what they were when people like you and I grew up. And that's true even in places like China. It's not so true yet in places like India or in Africa, but nevertheless people are becoming aware of it there as well. So the solution to all this is for us to get used to the idea of looking at everything as part of a collective experience, where everything that happens is a product of more and more minds being aware of what others are doing, which was not the case before.
You know, it's a funny thing today. Back to the anecdote, there was one family in front of me in Tampa that had two young girls, probably 14 or so, and in front of them was a mother and father and a grandmother, and the three adults were in charge of working the electronic kiosk, and you could see the two kids tapping their foot, like wanting to elbow their way through the adults, saying, "Let me get to the kiosk." And I had no doubt that they would be able to do what they needed to do, but it's
The
just.
younger people are ahead of most older people in adapting to the change.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I saw it right there. Let me try to draw a perhaps unwarranted line between the change and the incident in Baltimore last week, and more importantly, the reaction in Baltimore, which I think was quite stunning. 144 cars burned, 15 buildings burned, over 300 arrests, the National Guard, et cetera, all 32 miles from Washington, D.C., in what had been thought to be a fairly tranquil town insofar as race relations were concerned. Could we draw any globalization lessons from that?
Ah, what a question. The communication, the news spread could never have involved so many people as it did so quickly in previous times.
Hmm.
It's only very recently that it's been possible for so many people to become aware of what's going on and to react to it so fast.
Hmm.
And that's, of course, now happening on a much larger scale than what happened in Baltimore.
Hmm.
So that news that used to take months to get around now can be instantaneous and because people are listening, people are aware of other parts of the world and other parts of their own society in a way that they used not to be. There can be, whereas people wouldn't have reacted at all in the past, now they react immediately.
They,
So
they do react immediately, and not only the viewing audience, but the people on the ground in Baltimore. You could tell that they were as tuned in as anybody because when the interviewers finally would interview them and talk to them, they were as versed about the process of the police investigation, when was going to be turned over to the state's attorney. They knew more of that than the viewers did.
yeah.
So, well, I would just close out by saying if you wanted to have three or four people read this book right now, who would you recommend? What group or what humans or what types of people? I mean, who needs to understand that this rate of globalization and the unevenness is really the root cause of many of the problems we face today?
The most important thing is that different types of people read it,
Mm,
and that it gets around, and not just in this country. Um, because what we want is for people to understand that it's not just a Western idea and it's not just the spread of Western influence.
well, very good, Professor. On that note, I'll go back to my autographed copy. All right.
Okay,
Thank
we'll
you very
see.
much. We'll see you next week.
Okay,
All
bye.
right. Bye.